conserved patterns in hierarchical organization, and I believe this is useful for understanding translation between different paradigms, including understanding preclinical models of diseases as well as translating those to clinical trials. Additionally, there's this notion out there that's been emerging called big data, where we're essentially being overwhelmed by the amount of data that's being generated in all different types of fields, whether it's climate change, disease models, whatever you can collect data for. We're basically in a data deluge where we're having a really hard time understanding how to deal with and analyze and interpret all this data. So I'm going to talk about some of the approaches that we use at UCSF in my work, where we use multivariate statistics and rapid data visualization to interpret complex neurological disorders. I'm going to show you a proof of concept of how I've been using this for the clinical trials that have been funded by MAPS for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. And then at the end, I'm briefly going to talk about the project that me and my colleague Julie Megler are trying to get underway, in which we want to explore ayahuasca as a candidate therapy for treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. So for those of you that don't know what a fractal is, this is an example of a fractal. It's a mathematical representation of a conserved pattern that kind of models what you see in nature. And what's interesting about this is that no matter what scale you look at it, the organization of the entire structure is represented at smaller and smaller scales as you zoom in. And just found a cool little video. So I feel like this is an important thing for translational scientists such as myself to kind of look at, to try and understand potentially what we can learn from these types of patterns that exist in nature, to try to understand how different behaviors and anatomical features and various other components of life and existence are translated at different levels. It could be different species, it could be different paradigms. So I feel like it's an important thing for us to look at as scientists because, especially in the field of medicine, we are really proving to be unsuccessful at the whole clinical trials process. And a lot of things aren't translating from preclinical testing, which is wasting lots of animals' lives, millions of dollars, and then don't successfully translate into a human clinical trial to influence standards of patient care. So this is potentially a problem. And so I kind of took a step back and decided, well, what else can we identify in nature that is conserved? And there's quite a few patterns that seem to be conserved across different paradigms in nature. One, this is kind of something that's been going around the internet, where this branching pattern seems to exist. It's sort of like this path of least resistance that emerges. You see this in how molecules are structured, the way that neurons are connected to each other, similarly the cardiovascular connections throughout the body, ground cracks that happen, as pressure relief, tree branches, rivers, and even how galaxies connect to each other. Additionally, we also see another conserved pattern with spirals. You can see this with ammonites and worms, hurricanes, again, galaxies. And then mandalas, which are one of my personal favorites. I actually have some mandala tattoos, and this is one that's dear to my heart. But you see this also conserved in snowflake structures. If you have a plot of sand and you put a certain sound vibration on it, you get this mandala-like structure as a representation of the sound. And additionally, just walking around this city, I've noticed a lot of the Catholic churches have this symbol on the outside, which is kind of interesting. So the reason I'm interested in this is because, like I said, I'm a translational neuroscientist. And so in the work that I do at UCSF, I have an NIH grant to specifically identify conserved patterns that exist between preclinical models and clinical correlates of cervical spinal cord injury that particularly affect hand and arm function. And so what I'm doing is I'm collecting data from all these different research centers and applying big data analytics to try and understand what methods, what functions are conserved between these different species so we can have a better therapeutic testing framework in place to test things that are coming through the pipeline for clinical trials. I won't go into the detail of this, but this is just kind of a table of all the different variables that we have for preclinical models and then the clinical correlates of that, and just the fact that there's a lot of things that at the clinical level we don't have a model for at the preclinical level and vice versa, and this is potentially a big problem if we're trying to develop all these therapies that are already in clinical trials and we don't really understand the disease that we're studying or the effect of the treatment. So essentially what our challenge is we have all of this data to try and model a disease, And we have essentially this correlation matrix of trying to understand how all of these things are related to each other in a systemic way to understand what is the overall state of the individual that we're trying to treat, or the disease that we're trying to model, or the paradigm that we're trying to understand. And what our approach, our solution to this approach is this thing that we're coining called syndromics. It's adopted from epidemiology, where we essentially want to characterize the entire syndrome of a disease using big data analytics and bioinformatics. So essentially applying pattern detection algorithms to large data sets to figure out what the emergent patterns are in whatever data set you're looking at. And so what this essentially does is it takes this very complex array of correlations and distills it down into these syndromic features that more accurately represent the systemic state of the disease model or paradigm that you're looking at. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. This is just an example of how the specific method of multivariate statistics that we use on our data set. It's called principal components analysis. It's essentially a pattern detection algorithm that reduces the dimensions of your data set into these multivariables that basically show this intersection between all the different variables that you're measuring, and then can show in a three-dimensional space how your subjects are going to fit into a three-dimensional space that it captures the full complexity of the data set, but it reduces the dimensionality of it, so you can understand it better. And so this is an example of spinal cord injury where these are uninjured subjects that differentiate in this dimension, but in another dimension, a different type of paradigm differentiates here. So that's still kind of a bit complicated and probably not as easy to understand as what I'm about to show you. So what we're doing to further make this a little bit more easy and user-friendly is to use topological data analysis, which essentially applies the notion that data essentially takes on a shape. When you take it at the systemic level and you apply multivariate statistics to it, the subjects in the data set are going to take on a certain shape that you can then visualize here. And what our visualization software does, that I'll show you in just a moment, is it takes all of these subjects that have shared variability and shared features at this syndromic level and clusters them all together into these nodes, and then you can connect each node to another cluster of subjects that are in another node based on a subset of shared features as well. And so what we get, and this is an example of what happens when I apply the MDMA-assisted clinical trials data with this topological data analysis, is we get this, this network topology. So it's essentially a topological map of, or sorry, a topographical map of, no, topological map of the entire data set, and it can be colored with the variables that you want to assess to understand how all of the variables, thousands of variables are thrown into this data set and how that they map onto this network topology. And so just to bring it back to these patterns that exist that we see, I was noticing that this looks very similar to the Kabbalah tree of life in terms of these nodes with up to 5 different connections to other nodes. And so this is kind of seems like that might be how this works. So getting into the actual data that I want to show you. So I was gifted the clinical trials data from MAPS. They gave me de-identified data to analyze in my system, previously published data. I don't want to go into the details of all of their study, but just basically it was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial where subjects that met specific criteria for PTSD were enrolled in the study and then randomly assigned to treatment groups, either placebo control or MDMA, and both received assisted psychotherapy as an adjunct to their treatment. And just again, trying to understand all of the different components of the study at this univariate level can be very complicated to figure out what's actually going on systemically from this study. And again, it recapitulates this big data problem that we have. But essentially, the findings from their study were that with just a few doses of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, people with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder were able to show remarkable recovery and reduction of their PTSD symptoms, both clinically assessed as well as assessed by the subject themselves. So getting back to the network topology of this actual data set, so that principal components analysis I showed you before, this dimension reduction is the analysis that's driving this network topology that I'm showing you. And essentially what this does is it differentiates the inactive placebo group from the MDMA treated subjects. So this is an enrichment of whether they received the drug or not. So red nodes means that every subject in these nodes received placebo, and every subject in these nodes received the MDMA, and colors that range within that heat map are kind of a mixture of both. Okay, so, and just to point out that this flare right here, these were a couple subjects who actually withdrew from the study, which you can see, even when you still analyze their data, which these would potentially be considered outliers, they still, differentiate from the rest of the flare, or the rest of the topology. So getting into the results, so this is the clinically administered assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder, the CAPS scale. And so this heat map here shows the range of whether this is sort of the cutoff above here. This is when they would be considered to have PTSD, and this would be they no longer have PTSD. And so in this network topology, again, remember these are the placebo groups and these are the MDMA-treated subjects. At the start of the study, before they received any treatment, all the subjects had clinically diagnosed levels of PTSD. After several treatments, however, as was shown in the study, and this is just kind of like a proof of concept that we can reproduce the results of their original study, we do see that the placebo group doesn't recover, they don't have an extinction of their PTSD symptoms with the treatment, but the guys that got MDMA did. And so this is the clinically administered one, and then there's a self-reported impact of events scale, which is one of the other major outcomes that was in the original paper. And again, they still show this reduction in PTSD symptoms as a result of the treatment, which again just confirms what the original study already showed. However, I was able to find something novel with this new data analysis, which I found very interesting. And so I want to point your attention to these subjects here, which functionally didn't seem to recover as well as the other MDMA-treated guys, even though they did get MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And so what this data analysis software does, it allows me to select these subjects, these nodes, and ask what's different between the two. And it gives me an answer very quickly. And it turned out what it was that these particular subjects had not had any prior ecstasy use. The subjects that did have prior ecstasy, so this is one of the exclusion criteria for the clinical trial was that they couldn't have done ecstasy previously more than 5 times. So that's what the red nodes here indicate that they had done ecstasy 5 times, and then the colors going down to blue indicate that they had done sequentially less. And so basically, the guys that are recovering better in the MDMA trials are ones that had previously used ecstasy, and additionally, their heart rates were more elevated. This wasn't a statistically significant elevation of heart rate because the safety study proved that it was actually safe. But just if you look at the range of variability within how the heart rate was monitored in this giant network topology of all these different variables, they all map on very nicely to each other. And then when I color code for what the trauma etiology was, it turns out that the guys that were doing ecstasy prior to the treatment were predominantly war veterans who obtained their trauma in combat. And so this is what I have a particular focused interest on because I'm interested in PTSD and war veterans. And so as a lot of people are being made aware of now, there's a high incidence of war veterans with PTSD committing suicide, and that statistic is significantly higher than those that are being killed in combat. But interestingly, when I color-coded for whether they had suicidal tendencies, the subjects that previously had done ecstasy had much lower, or actually no suicidal tendencies going into the study. So conclusions from the MDMA PTSD analysis, I was able to reproduce the effects of the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD on multiple measures using this big data analytics approach. And using this in combination with this visualization software, I was able to show a novel finding of prior ecstasy use enhancing PTSD recovery with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And so I think what the implications are of this is that potentially taking this medicine is priming the system to respond better to it. And so this is something that we actually see in spinal cord injury experimentally. You can do a conditioning lesion before giving the spinal cord injury, and the subjects actually will do better because the system is primed for that intervention, or whatever it may be. So switching gears a bit, like I said, I have an interest in post-traumatic stress disorder. And after I finished my dissertation, I had just gone through a really messy divorce and was really kind of burnt out after finishing my PhD in spinal cord injury. And so I went down to a healing center in Peru for just some therapeutic refuge. And as just fate would have it, I happened to go down with a bunch of war veterans who had pretty severe PTSD. And it was quite amazing to watch the transformation of these guys from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip and see how much the ayahuasca was really helping them overcome the symptoms of their trauma. And I was blown away by this. I think I found out about ayahuasca a few months before this. It was totally new to me. And I came back to the United States. This was in between my graduate training and my postdoctoral fellowship here. And it kind of retuned me and repurposed the direction of my work. So I was actually so burnt out from graduate school that I was going to leave neuroscience altogether. But going down to the center and seeing the therapeutic potential of this medicine on such a complex psychological traumatic disorder, I decided I had to figure out a way to study this and make it part of my career. So this is an example of one of the war veterans who shared his post-therapy, post-ayahuasca trip report with me, and I dumped it into Wordle, which is a word frequency website that will give you these word clouds based on how much a certain word is represented in a set of text. And this particular guy at the start of the retreat was actually really angry. He was very mad all the time, and by the end of it, he was much happier. He felt more of a sense of peace, which is represented here. He's talking more about peace. And the thing that really popped out at me was the fact that he really did think that this was medicinal therapy, and I just thought that was amazing. And so getting back to like this fractal nature of existence, I found it interesting when I started researching more about ayahuasca and that the psychedelic component of ayahuasca is dimethyltryptamine, which exists in multiple plants and animal species. You know, it's an endogenous neurotransmitter in humans and animals, and it also exists in plants, which is where we can derive it to make the ayahuasca brew. DMT, so this is from Rick Strassman's book, the DMT, the spirit molecule. And so it may be released at the moment of death. And I think also it's potentially been shown that it also is released in the fetus 49 days after conception, which Buddhist texts also say is the point at which the spirit comes into the body of the developing fetus. And so therefore it's been dubbed the spirit molecule. And additionally, I find it interesting that there seems to be ubiquitous, commonly shared conserved experiences with people that do DMT and ayahuasca. There's definitely a conserved theme with people that take this. So just kind of mining the data, because I'm a data scientist and I like to see what information is out there. I mined some of the information on ERIE, basically the trip reports on ayahuasca, and just plotted the number of reports versus what the person that posted it categorized it as. And so there's, just 80 general trip reports, but then subcategories of those, I found interesting that even though most people reported it as being a very difficult experience, they also say that it's, even to the same extent, it's a glowing experience and it's a mystical experience, and it seems to be beneficial, so that potentially it's a difficult thing to go through, but the rewards are well worth it. Okay, so my colleague Julie Megler and myself are trying to get a pilot study underway to assess ayahuasca as a candidate therapy for PTSD. We have a letter of collaboration signed with the Petiti Institute near Iquitos in Peru, where we're trying to get an IRB approved, where we're going to first do retrospective data collection of all the subjects that have gone to that center and do some interviews with them and see what is their post-therapy interpretation of how the ayahuasca has been helping them. And then additionally, we want to do a prospective observational study down at the Petiti Institute, where we'll follow a group of subjects that have PTSD. We'll have a certain amount of criteria, make sure that they're not on any contraindicated drugs prior to going down, as well as perhaps meeting a certain level of PTSD criteria in terms of severity. And then once we can gather all this data, I plan to use this big data analytics approach to identify different therapies, because I feel like there could be a better screening process in terms of what types of treatments we're going to give to certain people. So if you can more accurately characterize a certain disease, and you can more accurately understand what the nature of the person is. I mean, so like people that have had ecstasy previously in their lives respond better to ecstasy treatment. Potentially that could be an important thing for us to include in our data sets, so that we can better treat people on an individual basis. And I'd like to acknowledge MAPS for donating their data, the Craig Nielson Foundation, who funds the visualization software that I use, and my NIH money.